Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennet Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, I want to recognize and thank the Dora Foundation and Eaton Vance for making this program possible. Thank you. My name is Kristen Odle. I'm a staff member and host of In the Making. Today, we are joined by Sarah Turner, our president at NBSS, James Mason, who is Dean of the Faculty at MassArt and also on our Board of Advisors, Barb Baker, our Locksmithing department head and also a graduate of our program and my pal, Jackie Blombach, a graduate from our Preservation Carpentry program and currently a preservation consultant, and Andy Haines, frame conservator, formerly at the MFA and also an NBSS advisor. I'll hand it over to Sarah to talk about why we're all here today.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in from wherever you may be, and welcome to our guests. It's really been a pleasure to get to know this interesting group of people as we gather them together for this conversation. And although Kristen has introduced herself as the host, and that's true, she hosts our In the Making series, she's also a panelist with us today with her own stories about how she came to craft. So it'll be great to have all the voices together. So we thought that what we'd do is we'd share stories of how things started, because we at North Bennet have been thinking about our origin story as a school. And we've been thinking about that because North Bennet will turn 140 years old this year in 2021. And so thinking about our origins has been a really interesting way for us to understand our present and also plan for our future. So as we approach one of our annual celebrations, Founders Day, which comes up next week on February 4th, we've just been thinking about how the school started, how the people who are involved with the school started their creative work and their craft origin stories, because so many people help make up this place. And so we're just interested in how people came to what they do or have done, because it's so much about what makes us a community. And I'll also say that, we've found, and I'm sure it's true for people listening, that crafts and tradespeople have really incredible origin stories. They come to this work from all avenues, from all kinds of life experience. You'll hear they come from music and fashion. People who come to NBSS come from farming and machining. They come from all kinds of fields. So we've gathered up this small group of community members, sort of representatives, to talk about their origin stories and hopefully to inspire you to reflect on your own, or if the time is right, to think about starting a new origin story. There's always a new origin story to start if you want. So we hope that you'll think about your own story and share those with us. We've got some social media platforms that are really active this week and next, sharing stories of how people came to craft and trade. So we'd love to hear how things started for you as you listen along or over the next days. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Kristen, and I think she'll get us started on some images and some stories.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Let me very inelegantly share my slideshow here. So our panelists dug deep into their lives of craft and brought us images from their life that sort of tell their origin story. And we invite you all, our guests, to do the same, our panelists and our guests, if you are on social media between now leading up to February 4th, which is Founders Day. If you want to post images on your social media channels, tag NBSS. And if you're a hashtag kind of person, you can hashtag life and craft, and we will see that. So I'm going to jump right in here, and we are going to begin with Andy. Andy, tell us about your craft origin.
Well, hi, thank you. First, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and congratulations to the other panelists. And I'm truly honored to be asked about my origin story. It is relatively humble. I'm from a very rural part of southern New Jersey. And the photo you see here is, I'm well into my 20s, but I briefly had a artist in residency at Yosemite National Park in the 1980s. And I was there for 6 weeks to be the artist in resident, which was a wonderful opportunity. Kristen asked me for a picture of me in my youth, and I wanted it to be of me doing something, but it's hard to imagine in this time that we're just soaked with images. There weren't really that many pictures of me in my youth because you needed, when it was photography, somebody had to take a picture and then get it developed. So this is what I came up with.
It's great.
For up until last July, for the last 30 years, I've been the frame conservator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I was that museum's first actual named frame conservator, but certainly not the first person to work with the frame collection. But I started there in 1990, and where I was a curatorial assistant, and that basically meant I schlepped things around for the curators and into the conservation department. I had gotten the job because I was working for 6 years before that. I was working for a frame shop called the Old Cambridge Company, where by the time I left, I started as a van driver, but by the time I left, I was the head of the wood department, and I had a lot of experience with framing. And through not the North Bennet Street School, but the Elliott School, I had learned gilding and a number of other trades and applied for the job, as funny as it sounds, from an ad in the newspaper. This was a time before the internet in 1990. And I applied for the job and got it. So, and I worked there for 30 years and actually made my boss, Gordon Hanlon, created, was my boss, and we had the furniture and frame conservation department at the Museum of Fine Arts, and I was the first frame conservator. Here's a photograph of me at the museum, actually making a frame or making a reproduction of a frame. And on the left is a corner of a very beautiful Louis XVI frame that I was doing that had a number of losses, but I was making repairs and using alternative means. The biggest thing I was able to bring to my time at the museum was coming up with alternative means of infilling gilding. So if you can imagine, gilding is generally in a world of water where it's water, glue, gesso, and gold. Traditionally, that was repaired with using the same materials, but no one could ever take that apart. I found out that one could gild directly onto acrylic paint, and then using acrylic as my binder, I went from a world of water to a world of alcohol, and which was a lovely thing. So you could, by doing my fills in acrylic, I could remove my work with using alcohol and acetone at some point in the future if somebody needed to.
Andy, you mentioned at one point that you know, part of your career and where you are now in this world of craft, part of your craft story is being in the right place at the right time and happenstance. And you referenced the great job that you had, which was assembling water beds. Tell us about that.
So I went to, I am not a program trained conservator, so I came in through the side door into that field. I owe it all to having a driver's license, essentially. In college, I studied painting at the Tyler School of Art, Temple University. And while I was there, a friend of mine turned me on to a job where I would arrive at people's homes and assemble a waterbed for them. I did this in Philadelphia one day a week, and it actually paid pretty well. And it was interesting because you got right into people's homes. When after graduating from college and trying to find a job, that was my marketable skill. So visiting friends here in Boston after traveling quite a bit immediately after college, I saw an ad in the paper for a waterbed installer and decided I would move to Boston as a career move since I had those skills. I was hired there. The job here was a lot more complicated because I had to not only assemble the bed, I had to get all the parts there, and drove a van. So from that van driving experience, that's how I started working in, I I did that for about 5 months here until I got a job at the old Cambridge company working with frames as their van driver. And
I
ended
love
up
that.
being the
You
wood
can
department.
you can draw a direct line from
I can draw a
waterbed
direct line to that.
the
It's really
MFA.
it was a high school friend that taught me about that showed me the opportunity in Philadelphia, and it's hilarious that that's how I ended up being where I am.
That's so great.
And so the other reason for this is I am a painter. This painting was a painting I made about 3 years ago. It's relatively large and it's sitting behind me in the room. That's why I included it in the slides, because it's a dark day, but you can see it back there. That's my neighborhood in Forest Hills. And it's the intersection of, I'm always interested in the intersection of the artifact and history and how things tell us that. I've lived in Forest Hills for almost 30 years now. And this is the Stony Brook Valley. I live on a hill on the left-hand side of the screen. The Arnold Arboretum is across from Forest Hill Station on the other. It's definitely a valley, but there is no river. The river was buried some in the 1870s. It's still there, but you can't see it. And that's both in conservation and in painting. That's one of the things I always thrill to, is the thing that's there that you don't see.
That's wonderful, Andy. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to jump into my craft origin story. I would have to trace my craft origin to my great-grandma Grace, who's this woman with the arrow pointing towards her. She always had a sewing needle in her hand, was always embroidering, sewing, baking, making, that sort of, you know, what a woman would do waiting for her husband to come home from the mines kind of thing. And she passed down this idea to my grandmother and to my mother, and then to me, that if you can't find it or afford it, you make it. I think we all can sort of recognize that lesson that we learned early on. And that gritty creativity was all around me growing up. My immediate family was filled with musicians and artists, and I grew up in a community that really nurtured that. Even the city I grew up in had incredible music and arts programs in our public schools. So I flourished in this environment and had a cello put in my hands by age 5. This picture on the left here,
the things that lie behind someone. I keep thinking, Kristen, about like how your talents at North Bennet are so legible in the way that you design things and the way you have an aesthetic sense. But it took a long time to figure out that you were also a musician, and how much that kind of was a foundation to your story. It's great to see that early picture of you.
Oh yeah, that one. I know it's, you know, ultimately it was a tool that got me to Boston, which I'll talk about in a second. This picture is a forever vision of my dad at his drafting table as a pre-internet graphic designer, as we also, probably all of us can remember that kind of person. And this visual memory of always having a fixed space where you could walk up to it and get to work, like a real true workspace, much like, you know, the benches that are here in the school. That always stuck with me as just a maker artist, you know, to always have a surface to walk up to. And 2 things happened in my life that cemented my own creative and craft life course. At age 11, I had experienced the trauma of losing a parent, and I coped with that by diving head down into making things with my hands, sewing, collage, ceramic, anything and everything. And some of it was tacky, some of it was, you know, awful, some of it was tacky awful, but it was a life-saving force for me. And at the same time, I visited Boston and I performed in Memorial Hall at Harvard, which is this picture on the right. And that was a peak moment in my young life, because coming from mid-century cinder block, hurricane-proof flat homes in Central Florida, I was seeing for the first time the history and architecture of an old city like Boston. And I immediately fell in love with all that comes with that: restoration, preservation, you know, keeping old things alive in general. And I made that decision then that I wanted to live in Boston. And so I used my cello as my ticket out of Boston up here, or out of Florida up to Boston. And I brought my hand skills with me that kept me, helped me to cope and to heal and just become my own whole person. And that's when that path was forged, right at about this age at 11. And this last image, to me, embodies what all of this is about, that with hand skills, you can self-soothe anywhere. And that's really what craft means, and my craft origin story is emotional well-being. I think, exercise, diet, and making are all on the same level. And there goes the light. Sorry, everybody. We work in a building where we have sensors in every room, so bear with me.
The lights are on timers. But Kristen, we talk too about like how this allowed craft to be portable for you. And I think about this when I think about our students who are so dependent on our shops and our equipment for what they're making, but then have to adapt to something that is maybe more portable or smaller or just a kitchen table. And this was such an insight in when we closed in March, when people suddenly had to be really ingenious about how they could work at home. Our jewelers putting their bench pins on their kitchen tables and people getting little workbenches together. And you were mentioning like how you've always had a fairly portable practice too for small spaces or moving around.
Yes, this is that example. In Boston, we're real estate's at a premium, and my husband and I downsized at one point, and so I had to literally shrink my handcrafts into this tiny little, needle pointing pin cushion situation. So yes, you're right, Sarah. That's what makers do. I think you make do with what's in front of you.
It also strikes me that you've been able to move between fields, so to speak, like to sew and to paint and to play the cello, and that it doesn't seem like you have to do one certain kind of thing.
I don't. And now a lot of this creative work, making art or handwork is at a pause because now I have a home to renovate at the moment. So that's where my creative energy is going. So yes, you're right. And I just want to leave, the last thing I want to say about this is that it buoys me every day to come to work in a place like this where I'm surrounded by people who are also making those decisions, but that I also get to play a supportive role for them. I mean, I truly love my work, and thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, it's great.
And Sarah's next.
Oh, yep, I'm up. So, I think while people know me at North Bennet as someone who kind of works on the whole school and works with the whole community, there was a time when I was just like super focused on working on metalsmithing and jewelry. So this is an early image. I'm in my 20s here, and I'm raising, which is a really traditional way of creating form out of sheet with just a hammer and a stake. So very low tech in some ways, and yet at the same time, very detailed. And for me, I think I kind of came to craft a little bit later than some people. I mean, of course, I did it as a kid and it sort of lit in my imagination, but I didn't start to pursue it seriously until after college. And when Kristen asked this question about craft origins, I just went immediately to this building in my mind. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, really surrounded by farm country, only a town of about 20,000 people. But it had a small college in the town, and they had an art center. And so I would go and I would take craft classes as a young person. And I chose this image because I have sort of a foggy, like a dim memory of the space. It was always just more the experience than the physical space. But it made me think about how important it is that modest craft and design and art and trade places need to exist in communities too. It can't just be the grand places. It has to be the simple community level places, because that's an entry point for people. So there was nothing fancy about this. There was nothing remarkable. It was truly a community-based place. And we were doing, corny craft, but it was an entry point. And somehow it just like still locks in there.
I loved that you submitted this photo because it does have this fuzziness to it, and how that speaks to these moments that you have in your life at whatever age that spark this interest and stick with you forever. And
Yeah.
just this fuzzy, the trees overgrown. I mean, I want to go and pull the weeds in front of this place, but that's part of your memory.
And then the next image I think Kristen's going to show, this is another one that I wanted to show that's just unremarkable in so many ways. This was a jewelry store in my hometown. And a friend of a friend owned a store, and she was a silversmith. And, you know, I came to find out later, you know, she went to Ohio State, and she went to one of these big state schools that had these terrific craft programs. But that didn't dawn on me till later. As a kid, I just was fascinated. One, that you could be a silversmith. I never knew that. And two, that you could own your own business and you didn't have to work for somebody else. Like, I hadn't really known that either. And so I used to just visit her, and, you know, I chose this image that was her shop, but this could be in any town in this country. It is, again, like pretty unremarkable, but it's a person making a living with a craft or a trade in this case. And she was making silver jewelry, and I didn't pursue it. I pursued other things, and it wasn't until I was, you know, in my kind of like mid-late 20s that I figured out I wanted to take a jewelry class. But it just sort of was like a little seed that was just always in there as a lifestyle, like the road untaken. And then I kind of just crossed over and took it later.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kristen wanted, like Andy said, Kristen wanted an image of us like doing something. And so this is when I was teaching metals and jewelry, and I loved getting to teach. I found out pretty quickly that I wasn't someone who wanted to have a solo studio practice. It was, I needed more interaction with people than that. And so it started out teaching community classes to people who are, I think right here I'm teaching people how to score and bend. We're making hollow forms out of copper. And anyway, it just was so fun to, a love of the skill turned into a real affection for the whole community. And it's now become really my social and professional community for so many years. And it's the community that I think is really what keeps me attached. I don't do a lot of metalsmithing these days, but you know, once you learn how to ride a bike, you don't forget. So it's like dying to get back to those solder seams someday.
Sarah, you also have a full art practice. So what did you spend more time in metals over paper and your other studio art?
I did, and I was really technically trained in metals. So I was really technically trained in metals and furniture making, and it was a pretty technical education. But I was at a place in Portland, Oregon called the Oregon College of Art and Craft that really married a strong technical education with conceptual development. And then when I went and got an MFA in metalsmithing, like, who does that? What kind of degree is that? You know, so specific, but it was definitely the art school route at that point. And then things opened wide for many of the reasons you said. You know, it was hard to maintain a full metal shop, especially as I was moving around the country. I was skittish about buying heavy equipment that I would need to own and move. And so Works on Paper provided me a way to kind of keep working with some of the same ideas, but be a lot more low tech, a lot more portable, and a lot less toxic, because I was sometimes living in my workspace too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, it's fun to share.
Yeah. Barb.
I love this image. I love it.
Thanks. Thank you, Kristen and Sarah, for inviting me to speak, and the sponsors of this session. And I feel like I've been learning so much about Andy and Kristen and Sarah. This is really great. I am an instructor in the locksmithing department at North Bennet. And this image is showing, this is representing my origin into mechanical systems. Just a brief background is I'm the youngest of 5 children, and excuse me. So I just came into a very active, from the day I was born, I was in a very active arena, having so many people around. My dad filled candy and cigarette vending machines. And so he ran a route, and on my luckiest day in my life ever, on a few occasions, he would invite me to come with him on one of his stops. And so this is showing the front door of one of the machines opened, and this machine is empty. All those little horizontal shelves would hold either a candy bar or a pack of cigarettes. And when you would, put the coins in and pull the mechanical lever, if everything went right, you would get the product. And so when I went with my dad to one of these factories, and I think I was about 6 years old, when he opened the machine, when he opened the vending machine, it truly was as if a choir rang out. I was stunned, and I just immediately knew that I wanted to work with mechanical systems. So I know that the inside of this machine, maybe it doesn't look that complicated, but to a 6-year-old, it was incredible. And I viscerally remember when we got to the machine, because it was in a factory, all the little shelves were in the down position because they were empty. And my dad would just take the back of his thumb and somehow he would just run it right up all those shelves, and somehow it would reset them all. And I kind of remember the action and the noise and thinking it was pretty grand.
I love that story, that you can still see that and hear it.
Yeah, it stunned me. I just thought it was beautiful. And then the other thing that you can't really see here, and my memory's a little foggy, pretty foggy on that, because it's been quite a few years. The coin handling system within was off to one side, but the technician or the service person would be able to pivot it outward and service it as need be. And these machines were frequently in factories back in the early 60s. And many of the machines had a little label on the front saying no Canadian coins. And I know Kristen and I were chatting about this briefly. And I don't know if any of you have ever run into that sign. But the reason is, in factories, whatever was being manufactured would often result in some byproduct pieces of metal that they would call slugs. Yeah. And the slugs often were ferrous material. And people and I won't say who, but some people in factories would try to pump a slug in the vending machine because it would be shaped the size of a quarter or maybe a nickel. Well, the machines had a magnet in line of where the coins would go in to catch the slug. And of course, if the slug was caught on the magnet, that would gum up the whole works until the service person could come and clear it out. Well, Canadian coins at that time had some ferrous material in them. And so a Canadian coin would be seen as a slug and cause that coin sluiceway to be jammed, would be obstructed. So, Kristen, that's the whole.
I got it. Okay, no Canadian coins.
Yeah, I had no idea. I had no idea.
The picture on the left is just a close crop picture of the inside of a large vault door. And to me, it's just beautiful. So I sent this picture to Kristen just because it's so gorgeous.
It is beautiful.
It is, and it makes it's a clear up close vision of what sparked your passion for this when you first went to the candy machine, because it's all mechanics.
Yes.
It's so interesting to take an origin story and hear it. Like, when I know you as a locksmith, it makes perfect sense that you would have been completely delighted by getting to restock and get inside a vending machine. It makes perfect sense. And so and when I hear Andy's story and I hear his trajectory, it makes perfect sense kind of in hindsight. But boy, it would be hard to script it like from the other way around, knowing that you really, really, really love vending machines, wouldn't necessarily predict that you were going to become a locksmith. Although I understand that you do try to kind of nose that out with your students. Like, do they like taking things apart? Do they like things mechanical? Do they like mechanical problems?
Yes, it's if when we are interviewing students that are applying for the school, if you can sense that person just has just something just delights them, you have a pretty good feeling that they're going to enjoy that field.
Yeah.
You have to love it.
Mm-hmm.
And before I became a locksmith, I did work in a television production factory in Cambridge, believe it or not. And when I was a technician there in the electronics department, I actually had an opportunity to work in the machine shop across the street, which was part of the same business. And I think that it's important that because I exhibited some enthusiasm to learn, that mechanics that worked in that machine shop saw that enthusiasm and were more than happy to teach me.
Yeah.
And so I would never call myself a machinist, but I had a ball over there learning from them. And they taught me some moves on the Bridgeport milling machine. And they had a metal bender. I mean, they had a lot of equipment there. So even though I was working in the electronics department, my gravitation really was to building things and working with mechanical systems.
Mm-hmm.
So great. So
Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to note to Andy, we may have a connection. And the way I learned about North Bennet Street School was by a gilder named Nils Johnson, who was an instructor, among other things, at the Elliott School in Jamaica Plain.
Absolutely. I learned gilding from Mills, or he was the first person that showed me the first things that I knew about gilding.
Yeah.
There you go.
Wow. Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, thanks, Barb.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story.
And I see that we're all relying on daylight, and it's all getting a little
I
dim.
know.
So I'm getting very dramatically lit. Andy's turned the light on. So if you have to adjust, go right ahead.
James, I'm leading with this image just because I love that it's you with your creation. So talk to us about your craft origin story.
So I'd like to begin with a note to Andy, and we have a slight connection. If we were to go back to that lovely painting of Forest Hills, I'd like to let you know that I live less than a mile from that intersection.
Oh.
So hello, neighbor.
Yeah, hello, neighbor. And it's a scourge, and it's always full of traffic.
Indeed, indeed. So there I am. And I'd like to give some context. So I grew up in a small, tiny Dutch town on the Hudson River, 13 miles south of Albany, New York. And as I think about my origins of my craft, I guess I'd have to say is every Sunday going to church, because talking about Sunday best was always Sunday best. And that was greatly influenced by my grandmother at that time, which was coming up. So that's actually my grandmother. So, and I was inspired by my grandmother to produce an entire collection based on her and the Black church and going to church on Sunday, and how Black women and Black men got dressed up. But I'd have to say, in terms of my origin, being a ninth grader and declaring that I was going to be a fashion designer, even though I had no idea what that was, I observed fashion from the outside in terms of the aesthetic, and later came to MassArt in Boston to develop my craft, and thereafter learned to observe my craft from the inside out. So I started looking at it from the outside, and now I'm involved coming from the inside to the outside. As I tell my students, no designer, no artist puts pencil to paper before they have an inspiration. And so that is what greatly influences me whenever I do my creations. I always have to be inspired. And there I am again.
James, I want to recognize something that I heard in your story that I love, that you, for you personally, the decision came first and the inspiration came later. And I love that. That's fascinating to me, that you knew what you wanted to be, not even how it would work, but you knew that's what it was going to be, and all of the information and inspiration came later.
Yes, I'd have to admit that saying that was easier than actually doing that. I didn't know how to sew until I went to college, and slowly learned through college. I can sew now, but there was a long process and what that looks like. But I guess the passion behind it made me plow through it, because it was always the end. What was it going to look like in the end? So it's amazing to me that all of us here, we have some craft that we may start with a raw material, but in our heads, we see what it's going to look like in the end, and we can make that happen. And that's an amazing talent to have and to continue to develop as well.
And I remember you telling us when we spoke before that there were some parts that initially you were not interested in. I think it was pattern drafting that you found not at all interesting, but I could imagine knowing that that was a means to the end, that you had to learn to do that. But it sounds like you came around to where that became more interesting to you.
Well, well, you can't do without it. Understanding students, when they do go into this profession, don't realize how much math is involved. I mean, it's drafting. It all is mathematics. And back in those days, I was like one of those students. So it really didn't interest me until I realized that you really can't do much without it. And so the trick is to create your own math to get what you want.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it as well.
I guess that's partly what you mean about like working on the inside of the craft. It's so interesting because when you think about fashion, it is so much about looking at it from the outside. It's such a performative thing. And I can imagine you kind of just taking in the sights of your grandmother and her community in their Sunday best, but then having to figure out how you do that, all the pieces to construct, to design, to make. That's really sounds like the inside.
Yes, it was the inside. And it was a lot of work, because the collection, you're looking at a little piece of it, but that was over 40 ensembles that I created in a summer. And part of that craft for me as an educator is that there are 9 months out of the year where I'm in front of my students, teaching them about fashion. And the 3 months that I'm home, I am exercising my creative muscles to ensure that when I go back that next semester, I'm ready to go and match them as well. and they appreciate the fact that I can show them my work and tell them, I do what you do. So we're doing this together.
Mhm.
Those are
James, did you have, were there people in your childhood before you were in the 9th grade and decided I'm going to be a fashion designer? Were there people around you making things with their hands growing up?
There were. My cousin was always sewing things, but I was also took art classes in high school and elementary school, so I was always in the arts and always painting or doing whatever it was, illustration, until I decided fashion was my thing. So I started drawing clothing. So I would have to say there were very few of my relatives or friends around me that actually made things with stitching things together. And I always wished that I had taken home ec, though at the time guys were starting to take home ec, but I just didn't, and realized that that probably would have served me a bit and put me ahead of the game.
Yeah.
But I guess I say that I was a creative kid, and I would have rather have either stayed in my room, read a book, or illustrated, or made something. And that's where that came from.
Yeah.
James,
Beautiful.
I put this slide in here because you were very clear about this was a collection that you designed for yourself and what you want to wear. It was not for anybody else, but for what you want to live in. And I love that.
Yes, thanks. That was my last collection. I thought my inspiration is me. And not that I have a big head, but my thought was that because I really love fashion, wearing it as well as making it, I would create a collection of what people would see me in and say, or look at and say, yes, James would wear that.
Yeah.
And so the whole collection was based on my closet, let's say.
Mhm.
So nice.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
James.
thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Jackie,
Yes.
Jackie, will you share your story with us? I'm not seeing you, but I know everybody else is.
Yep,
Okay.
we're seeing her.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you very much. And it's lots of fun to hear all these inspiring stories. And James just made me realize that I had to take home ec and I sewed a lot. And it didn't even occur to me that my sewing experience had anything to do with what I'm talking about today, but I guess it has. Because starting in 6th grade, I actually did make a lot of my clothes, and all through high school. And then in college, I made a lot of dance costumes. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, you're talking about origin stories. And this is a picture of my dad building a fireplace from scratch, and the fireplace, the inside of the house. And the interesting thing about this is my dad is probably my biggest inspiration for almost everything I did, I guess. And he was one of these guys that could build almost anything. And if he didn't know how to do it, he'd go to the library, pull out the books and do it. And so my mother, we lived in a typical ticky-tacky 1950s ranch house in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And my mother really wanted a fireplace. So my dad built her one. And he had a shop downstairs in the basement, and he was a craftsperson, and he would make things for fun. He would make a jewelry box for my mom, or he would make cribbage boards that were all with beautiful inlaid wood. He was just one of those guys that could do everything. And I'm sure that much of my interest in building, woodworking really came from him. And then if I look back, my great-grandfather was actually a cabinet maker. He was a Finn. And when he came over from Finland and settled in New Hampshire, he was a cabinet maker. But I was a dancer and started dancing when I was 6 years old and continued dancing my whole life until I was almost 50. And this is a picture taken in New York City about 15 years before I went to the North Bennet Street School. But I never certainly thought about doing anything but dance. But one day I had a love of old houses. And the back in the 90s, I went to an old house fair. And there was a table set up, and the North Bennet Street School was represented. And I went to one of the open houses and said, you know, someday I'm going to go to this school. Had no idea for what. But when the time came when I decided it was time to not dance anymore, and I was close to 50 years old, I decided to apply to the preservation carpentry program because of my love of old houses. Took a introduction to fine woodworking class just to see if I had the skills. And I applied, and lo and behold, I actually got in. So that's how I got into the world of historic preservation. I eventually got my master's degree in historic preservation. And although I'm not working at my craft in quite the same way, this is a picture of the Gibson House Museum, which is where I do a lot of consulting for, and I'm on the board there and oversee any kind of projects that needs to be done. I chair the building committee for this museum. And rather than going out and working in a crew after graduation, I worked at the Shirley Eustace House, which is another museum, and have been very involved at this museum. So that's sort of my history and how I came to North Bennet Street School.
We talked when, we were kind of making sense of an idea when we talked before about like when you do solo work and when you do collaborative work, and when sometimes you do solo work in collaboration with other people, because in some ways it seems like such a total left turn to go from being a modern dancer to being a preservation carpenter. And yet we were able to kind of tease out, like, there was solo work in dance, but it was in collaboration with other people. There was solo work in preservation carpentry, but you're in collaboration. And that seems to resonate.
Exactly, Sarah. And you found the connection. I love working with a group of people, and I love working with sort of as to reach a goal.
Yeah.
And certainly as a dancer, you're working with a choreographer, you're working with other dancers. And what I loved being at North Bennet Street School is in preservation carpentry, unlike maybe some of the other crafts, you are kind of working as a team on a project.
Yeah.
And I love that. And when I left North Bennet Street School, I really missed that.
Yeah.
But most of the work I do is really working with other people. I may be brought in to do some research. And so I've kept that kind of collaborative thing, because that's really, I enjoy working that way.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to like run out to my shop and just start working on something.
Yeah.
But if somebody says, hey, I want to learn how to do window restoration, I'll say, oh, come over, I'll teach you how to do it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love that collaboration.
Yeah, me too. I think it was partly why I kind of figured out the solo studio artist work wasn't quite right for me.
This wraps up our slideshow portion of this event. And I just want to remind everybody, if you are inclined to share your images for Founders Day, upcoming Founders Day, tag them on all the social media channels. You can tag NBSS and hashtag Life in Craft if you're into hashtagging. So
there's such a great representative of variety here, like there's no one path. And I think that can be so reassuring. I always have our students in my mind's eye, and I know they can put a lot of pressure on themselves that somehow you're going to go right from school to a professional career immediately. And it's just so reassuring to hear these slightly more meandering paths or these threads that kind of weave in and out. I think it's just so much more realistic and so inspiring. I think we are getting a few questions. Is that right, Kristen?
yeah, I'm going to stop our screen share here. and open up for questions. How did James, on your path, how did you become a dean? What was the journey from?
The journey. So I'm not sure if you all out there are familiar with Massachusetts College of Art and the recent goings on, but during this pandemic, the president resigned and left the college, and the provost was elevated to interim president. She called me while this was all going on and said, "Hey, I want you to be the dean of faculty." And we've never had one. So I'm the first.
Oh.
And so that was official of July 1st. So I've been in my positions July, not very long. So other than that, before that, I was professor of fashion for quite many years there at MassArt.
Well, it reminds me of something Andy said, or that Andy evoked for Kristen, was sort of like being in the right place at the right time. And I think there's sometimes our lives and our careers unfold in a way just by opportunity and happenstance and luck. I mean, we have a lot to do with how things happen, but a lot of it is just timing. It takes a whole new turn. Yeah.
I wanted to just input something that when I was trying to think of some talking points for today, and I'm not really sure if I stuck with any of them, but the vending machine, because I am an instructor and it's quite challenging, but it occurred to me, or maybe I already knew it, that teachers really are interested in learning. So there's this really great collaboration that goes on between instructors and students that are enthusiastic to learn. And I think if a teacher is looking at it clearly, they know that they are learning as well. And then it's a great exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Just a reminder to our guests, if you have questions for our panelists, you can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And a question that's been presented is if anyone would like to speak to, after sharing your sort of mentors or your situations that sent you on your journey and your life of craft, how, as you as a maker, how do you make time to mentor others? Now, I know we're talking to two instructors and a dean, but how do you pass that forward, I guess, might be a better way to phrase the question.
I have an example that I've been working with at MassArt. We have this program called Artward Bound, and it involves all Boston public schools from all around Massachusetts or the area. And these are high school students who start with us from 9th grade. So it's after school. And during the school year, they come in after school and they work with tutors, mentors, and artists. And during the summer, it's more intensive, some of them live on campus to get that feel of being on campus. But I have, for the last 3 years during the summer, taught a 2-week course with those students, exposing them to fashion. Basically, they make paper clothes with me to begin with, and then I take them through screen printing. But it's the mentoring and to see, and these are mostly students of color, which is very important to me in terms of the arts and public education, in terms of it's not only the arts and design that we are mentoring them with, but it's also the academics. So they get all of that support all the way until they graduate. And I believe the graduation rate is 100%. Great. And all of them do go on to higher ed. And so that's one of the things that I feel that it's important to me to carry on that with such young, impressionable students, to kind of point them in direction and mentor them that way. So that's just one example of that.
Yeah, it's great.
Thank you, James.
Yeah.
A question presented is, you've all had such rich, diverse lives in craft. What's an alternate art, trade, or craft-based job you've always wanted to pursue but have yet to have the chance?
I've always wanted to be a dahlia farmer and have a donkey sanctuary. That is my dream life.
Can those two exist together?
I think they probably could. So anyway, if I wasn't doing this life, I'd be trying to farm dahlias, maybe with donkeys.
I have a fantasy, and it kind of connects to everything. I've always wanted to be a landscape designer, and actually I've been looking for programs in historic landscape, but they aren't anywhere near where I live.
Yeah.
What have been the greatest challenges in your journey as a maker, and where to whom do you look to overcome those challenges? If someone wants to speak to that.
I mean, I think one of the things one of the challenges I think when you go into the craft or the trade is that if you're lucky, you have a lot of community support for that, and you have a lot of family support for that. But society doesn't really tell us that we need frame restorers, and society doesn't tell us that we need preservation carpenters. I mean, we know that we need those things. And if people really thought about it, they know that they need those things. So I have often felt like you need an extra sort of sense of like stamina and commitment, because everyone's going to tell you that you could be any number of things, but they're probably not going to think of the thing that you really want to do if you're a craft or trades person. And so I've always felt like you kind of need a strong sense of internal validation if you're going into something, sort of niche or more unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just do a quick one?
Oh, yes, please.
I just wanted to say, and Sarah, you mentioned this before, I would have to say the challenge is more to the point that when you graduate from school, going into your profession doesn't always happen. Quite frankly, it was over a 30-year gap. After graduating, I went into retail for 30 years and then came back to the college as a professor. And now I'm really happy that that happened. And one thing that I would say to students is that everything you've done and everything I've done in that 30-year period attributed me to be where I am. So it wasn't really a waste of time. It was just a life experience I needed to live to get to where I was.
And it wasn't linear. Someone's kind of made a comment in the chat about weaving paths. And I think you're so right, James, that all of these experiences and aggregate in you, and then you bring them to what you do. But it doesn't mean that they were linear. Yeah.
Yep, that is, somebody's said this, it's not necessarily a question, but just acknowledging that all of your stories, mine as well, a reminder that our career paths are often winding, and that, I mean, for me, what I would say to that is, paying attention to the signs and also following your own heart as well. I mean, you need to listen to your voice, and you knew you wanted to be a fashion designer in the 9th grade, and here you are, you stick to that truth,
It's important to say yes to opportunities that come up that may or may not look like a good idea at the time.
Waterbed installation.
Waterbed installation. So many things teach you something, and often you're moving backwards. I remember one of the biggest challenges in my younger painter life. So the painting aspect of my life has always been come and go, and you can never depend on it. I've always had enough success to keep me doing it all along, but it's never been something I felt I could make a living off of. And when my wife and I had children, one of the biggest opportunities I found out is there's 2 hours in every day that we all have access to that nobody's going to bother you, and that's between 5 and 7 a.m. And that is when I do most of my painting practice to this day. Since I left the museum, I've had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of work on frames for other people, but I still have managed to keep that time for painting.
Yeah, that's great. And I think sometimes the short bursts of time can be much more productive than if you even had a whole day,
Absolutely.
because you just know you got to get it done.
A question just referencing crafts through community colleges. I've always thought that community colleges were a great start for craftspeople. What do you think is the potential for broadening the learning of crafts through community colleges?
I think it's terrific. And I also think I would extend community colleges to community art centers, craft centers. I mean, the Elliott School has come up in conversation a number of times tonight. I invoked, a really small town craft and community center. So I think it's a really rich opportunity in community colleges. I think even things that aren't colleges, even things that are just learning centers, craft centers, after school programs. I love the program that James described. I think about Artists for Humanities, like these kind of alternative programs. So I just think we see retail places that are also teaching. I mean, there's just so many models for how someone can get exposed. And I'm so glad for it, that it's not just in any one place.
We're just at time or past time, and I want to leave this with one question if anybody who would like to jump in and answer this. Before I ask this question though, I need to announce something else. Somebody's wondering if we can get a candy machine at North Bennet Street School. It would be for instruction.
So it sounds like Barb and I should talk about that.
Yes, please. Thank you. And so my last question is, how has your practice made you a better person? What does your discipline teach you? I'll bite.
Okay.
I would say, it's, as I talked about my craft origin story, to me, it's about, emotional health and having this hand to mind connection that will keep me living for a long time. And so I think what it teaches me is calm, and I could say, it might sound cliche, but it teaches me empathy. To be still with something and just have that be the focus in the moment.
I think for me, one of the things I was sharing with Kristen was, when I learned to be a metalsmith, I learned about tools and materials and problem solving and fabricating and repairing. And while that was about jewelry, for me, that was most of all about capabilities and just being confident with tools, confident with, I've fixed my own copper plumbing at this point. I've reset a door in a door frame. I've glazed a window. Like, it had translation to skills that, especially as a woman, I really wanted to feel capable and not intimidated. And I think that's really served something beyond just the jewelry.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else that want to jump on that one?
I think for me, a lot of it is discipline.
Yeah.
And you need a lot of discipline. You need some kind of sense of, there is no such thing of perfection, but you're always striving for perfection. And I find those two things it's like a huge part of who I am. And certainly dance did that. Any kind of craft, handiwork with your hands, you're doing that. And finding the time to do it. You need the discipline really to make yourself do it.
From 5 to 7 a.m. it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
It's the best time of day.
Yeah.
I'm just going to thank you all for joining us, and you as our panelists for taking the time and sharing your lives with us and your images. And thank our guests for joining us this evening.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure to hear the stories. I think they probably are inspiring to a lot of people. We're getting those comments. They certainly are to me. And it's what I love about this work, is all the interesting people and the paths that they've taken. So thank you so much. And thanks, Kristen, for organizing and hosting.
Yes, thank you all for joining us this evening.
Have a good night, everybody.
All right.
See you
All right, take care.
Bye.